Hello, and welcome to the Feet on the Soil podcast, the podcast about the world beneath our feet and how we interact with it. You're joining me today on a beautiful day. It must be the warmest day of the year so far. I think it's 23, 24 degrees, which as far as Ireland goes is pretty up there. I'm sitting on a nice willow tree, one of my favourite willow trees of the many there are, and I'm just looking out over the lake at the moment, and the heat and just the kind of atmosphere of the day reminded me a lot of a lovely experience I had last year. I was out on a run, and it was one of those runs where everything felt like it was going right. My feet were only grazing the ground as I ran along. The sun was out, it was warm, but the sweat hadn't started pooling up on my forehead yet. And I was running along the River Dodder, probably my favourite river out there. And as I ran along, I was coming through a newer park, a park that up until a few years ago was agricultural sort of pasture and meadows. As I ran, I could hear this very distinctive call. It was a creaking call. And it was that of the corncrake, a bird which, even at that point where I was a little bit less knowledgeable about Irish wildlife, I knew that the corncrake was quite a rare bird to hear. I slowed my pace and I started to lower down to see if I could get a glimpse, because as rare as it is to hear a corncrake, it's rarer at the moment to see one. And as I hunkered down, I kind of duck walked along the path and quickly turned my head to the right as I heard a bit of rustling in the grass, and staring back at me was what can only be described as if a potato became a bird. This large, brown, lumbering, almost dodo-like bird staring back at me, and right next to it, another. They scarpered off pretty quickly into the growth of the grass, and I kind of sat there for a few minutes just delighted with myself. As much as these are rare birds in Ireland, they are especially rare in Dublin, and I wasn't too far outside of Tala, which was pretty impressive to see such a creature out there. I bring this up because the topic of today's podcast is about the rare and endangered animals in Ireland. Some of them so rare that they don't exist anymore. We'll get into that a bit later. But we're going to be looking at these through the lens of Irish folklore. Folklore is incredibly important in Ireland. As a country that is the product of a colonial past, a lot of our history was wiped out. Whether this was through the burning of certain books which contained materials about our history, it could have been the transformation, to use a kind word, of our pagan folklore into more Christian stories, ones that better served the wants and needs of the church. Through a series of invasions and takeovers, or whatever you want to call them, Irish history and folklore was altered a lot, but somehow a lot of stories have still made it to the modern day. Because of this, we can learn a lot more about our history, about the way our ancestors thought, about the way they treated the land, about the way the land treated them, through these stories rather than through actual history books. And in these stories, a lot of the time, animals take centre place. It's very clear when reading any of these stories that Ireland was a place which revered nature, which, as I've said many, many times, saw the magic in nature, but also had that sort of suitable fear of nature. You know, not everything was a beautiful thing to behold. Sometimes it could be scary, it could be threatening, and it could impact life. Ireland's folklore was retained in this way because of our oral tradition, where we do have things like Ogham and certain manuscripts that were written later on. Ireland's history is not in tablets or paintings, it's in stories. As anybody who's ever been to an Irish pub knows, Irish people are well able to spin a reel. We are well able to tell a good story. And this isn't by accident, this isn't a modern inclusion in Irish culture. This is Irish culture. Stories were handed down around campfires to scare, to show romance, to tell history of the land and to mark out important parts of the land. These stories were shared from travelling storytellers and poets, but also just by local people sat around the fire looking to entertain themselves as day drew to night. And as I mentioned, many of these stories focused around animals. It may have been about the transmutation of humans into animals. It may have been how Setanta became Cuchulainn, the Hound of Cullen, after he killed his dog with his hurl and slither. Or it could be things about mythological beasts, things like Selkies or the Good People. Many of these stories, if not all, have some sort of influence from our animals. And in many cases, these animals were used to convey a message, to tell a story, to warn us about what happens when we mess with what we shouldn't mess with, or to tell us about the history of our landscapes. As a result of these, we can see that some of these animals were guardians of the land. I started off the podcast with a little story about my discovery of 2 little corncrakes. The corncrake, while rare and hard to find at the moment, was once easily heard in most agricultural fields around Ireland. Much like the cuckoo, the corncrake is a migratory bird, even though its round body and shorter wings may not look like it can travel long distances. Sure enough, it leaves us at the end of summer and arrives back the following summer to grace us with its not so beautiful call. But because of this, the craking call of the corncrake was associated with the bringing of summer. It was also believed to transform into a moorhen once the summer ended, because we simply could not believe that a bird of its shape and stature was able to make the long migratory journey. This is, of course, a more modern and less, I suppose, magical example of how folklore impacts our knowledge of animals and their patterns in the past. But there's plenty more, especially in Irish mythology. As previously mentioned, we love to talk about animals and their behaviours and kind of personify them. This is really interesting from just a storytelling point of view, but as far as kind of ecology goes, this is really interesting as it gives us a view of how these animals were treated, their behaviours, the ecosystems they lived in, what animals lived where and even sometimes when. It's so important. Folklore in Ireland just serves so many purposes aside from just having an interesting story to tell at the pub or around a fire. My favourite example of this is 2 animals that, especially in Ireland, have a little bit of a controversial nature to them. Neither of them can be found in Ireland widely anymore, although one is trying its best, but they are of course the wolf and the boar. While both were once widespread in Ireland, both serving as keystone species in their own way, making a huge impact on the environment and on the landscape they inhabited, both were hunted to extinction. And although it was many decades or centuries ago that these were brought to extinction, their stories and their name still lives on very, very highly in the Irish landscape. You can get your feet on the soil bingo card out now, as I mentioned Glenasmole for what must be the 5th or 6th time at this point, but I am currently in the Glenasmole Valley, and just up to my right is a beautiful hill called C. Finnegan. It's thought that C. Finnegan represents seat of Finn, Finn being Fionn McCool, the anglicisation of this name. Fionn McCool and his Fenians are said to have hunted these valleys for wild boar. Now, while I walk around today, I can tell you that there are no boar in the valley, but through names like C. Finn and the stories that go along with him, and Glasamucky, a township just up to my left, which in Irish is Glosh na Muica, which I believe translates to something along the lines of grassy area of the pigs, with pigs presumably being a reference to wild boar. I also had a lovely experience in Mayo. I was in Wild Neffin National Park with a fantastic guide from the National Park and Wildlife Services, who told us how, through the old Irish names of areas in the valley, they could figure out what grew there and when. There was a valley that was known as the Valley of Boar, even though boar had not lived there for hundreds of years. There was an area known as the Valley of the Oaks, and in that entire valley there was but one oak tree. Now that's a bit off topic, but it's just to say that our folklore and our storytelling can have a huge influence on our understanding of the modern ecosystems that we see. I know from stories that boar would have existed here in Glenismole, and it's easy to wonder what impact would they have had on the ecosystem here. We see in the United Kingdom at the moment, boar are starting to make a comeback, and depending on who you ask, they're making a pretty positive impact. They create microclimates for things like birds to dust bathe. They show bare earth to allow seeds to easier take root. And while they can be aggressive if cornered, most of the time boar are actually pretty placid. They're not really going to hunt you down or anything like that. And although in Irish mythology we do see certain heroes killed by boar, this is usually a sort of a metaphor. It's kind of their service as guardians of the forest. To those who disrespect it, they can deal with the boar. The other is, of course, the wolf. Highly associated with sort of Celtic paganism and the rewilding movement. Wolves haven't been seen in Ireland since the 1700s, when the last one was killed on a riverside in Carlow. Of course, people have clung to the image of the wolf. It's a beautiful creature. Its social structure shows us sort of loyalty and kinship in the animal kingdom. And in general, it's a beautiful animal to look at. While all of this is true, it also has huge ecological impacts on any area it's brought into. I'm not going to go into it, but it's very easy to look up wolves in Yellowstone. This is one of the major examples of successful reintroduction around the world. And you can see how big of a difference they made. I know that the fact that's always thrown out is the introduction of wolves changed the course of a river there. Wolves in Ireland has been a debate for a long time, as our populations of feral goats and deer becomes a little bit of a problem with management. Even where I'm standing at the moment, it's quite a beautiful forest, but the understory just is not there. As soon as any plant makes any sort of headway, it's quickly chomped up by one of the non-native sika deer that inhabit the valley here. And while Glenismole specifically doesn't have any place names influenced by the wolf, an Irish name of... There are areas in places like County Clare, Knock-on Victira, Little Hill of the Wolf, or a small lake in Kerry called Isk Nac Macantira. Both of these places show the history and the importance of wolves in the area, and they are of course very prevalent in our storytelling tradition as well. But it's not all endangered creatures that Irish folklore focuses on. It also shows the importance of our kind of everyday creatures. One of my favourite sort of focuses of Irish mythology is on the cow. We see them every day, if you're from even a semi-rural area, but even if you're from Dublin, you don't have to travel far before you see a cow in Ireland. And from their prevalence in mythology, it seems that it's always been this way. There's a beautiful old story about how the cow first came to Ireland. There was 3 of them brought by a goddess. There was a white cow, a red cow, and a black cow. Once brought onto the island, these 3 cows spread out. The black cow and the red cow went to the south and the west, where the white cow headed towards the hill of Tara, where once it arrived, it had 3 offspring and then went to a cave nearby to sleep. This cave is not of our world, and that white cow, which it can be assumed represents some sort of purity or magic, still sleeps to this day in that little enchanted cave. Myths and stories about cows in Ireland usually focus around the protection of the cow. Of course, it was an incredibly important animal. It produced the milk and meat that we survived on for so long. And so we can really see this appreciation for the cow and this want to protect them and keep them safe in our stories. Again, there's many areas around the country that are named after the cow, but obviously they're far from endangered. We do have our smaller breeds, our native cattle breeds that maybe need a little bit more help, but there's a lot of projects on at the moment and smaller farmers who are really spearheading this movement of bringing back these native Irish cattle. And while we've lost our boar and our wolves, we do have some animals which are important in a folklore sense and that we still have, but the fear is that we may not have for much longer. The most important one of these, for me anyway, is the hen harrier. It's one of Ireland's most endangered birds, even more so than curlews or corncrakes. and it puts on one of the most impressive performances of any animal. The hen harrier also goes by the name of sky dancer. This is because during mating season, it is not the plumage or the call that attracts a mate to a male hen harrier, it's their acrobatic displays. They mainly inhabit upland areas of Ireland, and during mating season can be seen swooping up into the air before plummeting back down in a spiral sort of formation. It's incredibly beautiful. I've not been lucky enough to see it in real life, I've just seen the videos. But the unfortunate thing is that there's an estimate that if we don't change anything, the hen harrier will be completely extinct in Ireland within 25 years. What's especially, I think, harrowing and I suppose touching about the story of the hen harrier is that while there aren't any folklore, myths or anything like that specifically about the hen harrier that I'm aware of, there are stories about birds of prey and eagles in Irish mythology that I think have a particular poignancy at the moment. The eagle in Irish mythology was kind of associated with time and wisdom. There's a beautiful story about an eagle that soared in the stars before the formation of the earth, and it saw the entire creation of the planet. I believe it was cursed to live 1,000 years, and so too was a man on the planet below it. It wasn't until 1,000 years later that both were released of the curse and allowed to die together. And although these birds were sort of timeless and everlasting in mythology, it's very clear now that in the case of the hen harrier, the clock is ticking. That 1,000 years is coming to an end. There are things being done for the conservation of these, and we hope that it can be a success story. A little bit more hopeful is the story of the red squirrel in Ireland. A lot more compact, and in my opinion, a lot more cute than its grey American friend. The red squirrel has long had an association with woodlands and forestry in Ireland. Red squirrels are represented in mythology around the world, particularly in Norse mythology, where a red squirrel serves as the kind of messenger between the underworld and the eagles on top of Yggdrasil. I think there was a Marvel movie even that had this red squirrel character in it. Or no, it was God of War, the game. That was the first time that I saw a red squirrel serving as a nearly main character. But aside from that, in Irish mythology, one of the most prevalent red squirrels is the one that sits on the shoulder of Queen Maeve. On one, she had a red squirrel, and on the other shoulder, she had a bird. This kind of represented the messenger to the skies, being the bird, and the messenger to the earth, being the squirrel. Maeve was also seen as kind of menacing or chaotic, and this goes in turn with the red squirrel's reputation of being kind of a trickster, a little bit menacing, and it's easy to see that when you see them kind of rubbing their little hands together. They look like they're plotting against you. But all of that leads to the red squirrel kind of being almost a guardian of the woodlands. They can mainly be seen now in more ancient woodlands. They can be seen in the likes of the Cuilcha sort of plantations, but this is just because they're pushed out to them by the non-native grey squirrel. I think it's particularly interesting to look at the kind of success story of the red squirrel at the moment. We see that in the Midlands, red squirrels are beginning to appear in places they haven't for many decades. And with the increase in red squirrels, we're seeing a decrease in grey squirrels. In mythology, we see that these are the protectors of the woodlands, the ones that keep them safe. And while for the last few decades, they may have needed a little bit of help in protecting these woodlands, now as we see forestry coming to the kind of the forefront, people who never really had an interest in forestry are beginning to think about it, are beginning to go out on tree planting days, or even just giving a little bit of headspace to how Irish forestry is in such a bad condition at the moment. And as we see more people begin to care about these forests, begin to put their minds towards them, we see, of course, the regeneration of our forests, but also the comeback of our red squirrels. Maybe these guardians they need a little push, they need a little bit of help just to get going. I've briefly mentioned a few of the stories associated with these animals, how these animals are faring in our modern world and how we would have thought about them in the past. But one thing that I've always found interesting was, as I previously mentioned, these animals were seen as sort of guides in the past. They were seen as more connected to the earth than we are, and something that we could really learn from. I've had experiences in the past where I've been excited to see these rare animals, but I've also had experiences where I've seen this sort of more spiritual side of the animal. Over the last 2 years or so, I've gained a particular fascination with bats, and after looking into them, I began to see some of the stories associated with them. Of course, being the dark nocturnal animal that they are, there is a bit of a connotation between them and death. Last year I kind of had the first very close death in my family. It was the death of my grandmother, and very quickly followed by the death of my grandfather. And in the days leading up to the death of my grandmother, me and my girlfriend, we went to a sort of a meditation circle. It was for the full moon, it was out on the beach, and it was a particularly nice day. We did a few kind of movement practices, something I wouldn't really call yoga, but got the body moving. We lit fire on the beach and eventually sat down for a sort of a guided meditation. The guide for the meditation walked us through a sort of a warm-up. We were in this cave in our minds, and within the cave there was an entryway, and by going down that entryway you entered this other world. Once we entered, we were told to look out to see if there was some sort of guide animal, and sure enough I saw a bat. It wasn't this vivid image like a film still or anything like that. It's just my mind was filled by an image that I could decipher as a bat. It kind of guided me through, and I was brought to a clearing with a tree. Soon after that I did a meditation by myself, and again had this image of a bat, and it guided me to this clearing with a large beautiful tree, much like the one I'm sat beneath at the moment. It was only about 3 days after this that we were called to the hospital, just to spend the last few moments with my grandmother as she passed. And in that room I could not get the image of that tree in a clearing out of my mind. And I got a little bit of safety out of the thought that, my grandmother wasn't going anywhere. I could trust that little bat would guide her as well to the tree in a clearing. That was my first experience with sort of seeing these animals as guides, and almost kind of creating my own folklore, or getting really truly involved in the folklore of the country I come from. I hope it won't be my last. I'm sure it won't be my last. But it truly showed me the importance of these old stories, and how the fact that they place animals at such a prominence isn't a mistake. What I feel is important about this is our animals are in danger. We're losing insects and mammals at a rate where in the next coming decades, I don't know what's going to be here. I think by learning these stories, by valuing them, and by, I suppose, living them, you can begin to, at first, fear that these animals may not be here someday, but also learn how valuable it is to protect them. Get involved yourself in their protection. I think seeing the world in this sort of more mythical way can help with that. Maybe you've had a dream recently with a particularly prominent animal. I would look into it. I wouldn't think of it as just this passing dream. Look into the folklore of your area. Do these animals have prominence in your locality? Do the names of your estate hold the names of any animals that once lived there before you? And we can see in these stories of the fauna of times gone by just how much importance ancient people had for the other living creatures that inhabited their area. I do worry sometimes that we won't be leaving any folklore for the people of the future. We may not even be leaving any animals for the people of the future. But with success stories starting to come out, like the one of the red squirrel, and hopefully the one of the hen harrier, it does give me a bit of hope. And much like our episode about thin places, I encourage you, look into the folklore of your area. You can start with your country. You can narrow it down to stories about your county. You can go further and go into your township. See if you have anybody in your locality who's a known storyteller, someone who holds on to these stories that are really specific to your area. I think these are the ones that are most important to learn, the most important to protect. And if you do have anything interesting, any stories that are, they could be the ones specific to your locality, or they could just be your favourite piece of folklore from your country. I'd love if you could send them to me. Always love learning a bit more about these types of things, and hopefully I can share them, let other people know, And in that way we can learn to appreciate these stories and hopefully appreciate their subject matter. Thank you for listening, and try and get outside today.